The city of Crestwood hummed with the ceaseless rhythm of ambition and indifference, a sprawling concrete symphony where individual struggles often faded into the background noise. Among its diligent citizens was Robert Williams, a man whose life had once been a testament to courage and unwavering dedication. For 35 years, Robert had stood on the front lines, battling infernos that threatened to consume homes, businesses, and lives. He was a captain in the Crestwood Fire Department, a respected leader, and a hero in every sense of the word. His strong build, once a shield against the heat and smoke, now bore the indelible marks of his last, most brutal encounter. A warehouse fire, an unexpected structural collapse, and Robert had emerged not victorious but profoundly altered. The physical scars were immediately apparent, a network of angry red tissue stretching across his left arm and neck, pulling at the skin around his ear, a constant, vivid reminder of the blaze that had nearly claimed him. But it was the unseen injuries that truly crippled him. A severe spinal cord injury had left his dominant right hand in a perpetual tremor, a relentless, involuntary shake that rendered simple tasks monumental challenges. Confined to a wheelchair, his once self-reliant existence had dissolved into a humiliating dependence. Robert, who had once effortlessly scaled ladders and carried children from burning buildings, now struggled to lift a fork to his mouth without spilling its contents. The fire had taken more than his physical prowess. It had incinerated his pride, leaving behind only the ashes of a once unshakable self-image. His expansive home, nestled in the affluent Oakwood Hills, once a hub of family gatherings and laughter, had become a gilded cage. His wife, weary from years of unspoken tension and now overwhelmed by his constant needs, had left him shortly after his discharge from rehabilitation. His two adult children, immersed in their own lives, offered polite but distant concern, their visits infrequent, their calls perfunctory. Robert, once the patriarch, the protector, found himself utterly alone, surrounded by the echoes of a life he could no longer live. The silence in the sprawling rooms was deafening, amplified by the persistent hum of his medical equipment and the internal roar of his own despair. He spent his days staring out at the manicured lawns, the vibrant blooms mocking his withered spirit. The world moved on, oblivious to the quiet tragedy unfolding within his walls. One crisp autumn afternoon, driven by a desperate longing for a semblance of normalcy, Robert decided to venture out. His aide, a well-meaning but detached young man named Ronald Harris, wheeled him to the Gilded Spoon, an upscale bistro known for its exquisite French cuisine and its clientele of Crestwood's elite. Robert had frequented the establishment in his former life, a place where he was known, respected. He hoped, perhaps foolishly, that some fragment of that old life might still exist for him there. As Ronald carefully positioned his wheelchair at a secluded table by the window, Robert felt a flicker of anticipation, quickly extinguished by the familiar anxiety that tightened his chest. The meal arrived, a delicate salmon entree artfully arranged on a pristine ceramic plate. Robert tried to steady his hand, focusing every ounce of his will on the task. But the tremor, a traitorous beast, asserted itself with renewed vigor. The fork, laden with a piece of salmon, danced an erratic jig before his mouth, refusing to cooperate. Frustration mounted, hot and bitter in his throat. He clenched his jaw, determined not to give in. Then, with a sudden violent spasm, his hand jerked, sending the fork, the salmon, and then the entire plate clattering to the polished marble floor. The sound, amplified by the hushed elegance of the restaurant, was like a gunshot. A suffocating silence descended. Every head in the Gilded Spoon swiveled towards the source of the commotion. Robert felt a wave of shame wash over him, burning hotter than any fire he had ever faced. He looked up, his eyes pleading for understanding, for a flicker of human empathy. But what he saw was worse than outright scorn. Waiters, who moments before had been solicitous and attentive, suddenly found urgent tasks at distant tables, their backs rigidly turned. Patrons, some of whom Robert recognized from various civic events, averted their gazes, their conversations resuming in hushed, accelerated tones, as if pretending the incident had never occurred. Their faces, a mask of feigned ignorance, were a far more potent weapon than any direct insult. He was not just an inconvenience, he was invisible, an embarrassment to be discreetly ignored. Ronald Ixie flustered, mumbled an apology, and began fumbling with napkins to clean the mess, his attempts only deepening Robert's mortification. In that moment, surrounded by opulence and indifference, Robert had never felt so utterly, profoundly alone. The bitter taste of his shattered pride filled his mouth, more potent than any gourmet dish. Outside the restaurant, perched on an overturned crate by the alley entrance, sat a woman named Brenda Walker. Her hair, a tangled mass of grey and brown, framed a face etched with the lines of hardship and resilience. Her clothes, layers of mismatched worn fabrics, provided scant protection against the autumn chill. Brenda had called the streets of Crestwood her home for the past 15 years, a silent observer of the city's comings and goings, its triumphs and its tragedies. She had seen countless dramas unfold outside the Gilded Spoon, grand celebrations, tearful goodbyes, heated arguments, but few had tugged at her heart with such force as the scene she had just witnessed through the large, ornate window. She had seen the firefighter, his strong frame now confined to a chair, his hand trembling uncontrollably. She had seen the plate crash, the food scatter, and the immediate collective recoil of the restaurant's patrons. Unlike the well-dressed diners, Brenda didn't turn away. She didn't pretend not to see. Her own life had been a masterclass in invisibility, a constant struggle against the world's tendency to look through rather than at people like her. She knew what it felt like to be judged, to be discarded, to feel the cold sting of human indifference. As she watched the firefighter's shoulders slump, the raw agony in his eyes, she saw not a wealthy man, not a former hero, but simply a human being in profound pain, isolated and humiliated. She saw a reflection of her own enduring solitude, a shared vulnerability that transcended their vastly different circumstances. A memory flickered in her mind, a distant echo of a time when she too had felt the world's cold shoulder. A spark, small but insistent, ignited within her. A spark of recognition, of compassion, of shared humanity. Brenda remained fixed on the scene inside, her gaze unwavering as the embarrassment seemed to visibly consume Robert. She watched as he instinctively reached for a napkin, not to clean the mess but to hastily conceal the tremor in his right hand, a futile gesture that only underscored his shame. The silence inside the restaurant felt oppressive, broken only by the deliberate clinking of cutlery, from diners determined to emphasize their detachment. The waiters hovered nervously near the kitchen entrance, unwilling to approach the fallen hero who had become a source of awkwardness. Brenda took a deep, shaky breath, the cold air scraping her lungs. Her own stomach was gnawing with the familiar ache of hunger, a constant companion on the streets, but that physical discomfort paled against the emotional agony she witnessed through the glass. She felt a profound sense of anger, not at the clumsy accident, but at the sheer brutal indifference of the people surrounding him, the ones who had the means and the opportunity to offer a simple kindness, yet chose calculated avoidance instead. The thought solidified in her mind. To stand by to do nothing would be to partake in the same moral abandonment. Mustering a courage born of desperation and empathy, Brenda pushed herself up from the crate. Her joints protested with creaks and aches, and her tattered coat felt heavy and cumbersome. She adjusted the brim of a faded baseball cap, a small involuntary movement of preparing to face a world that perpetually rejected her. With slow, deliberate steps, she moved toward the heavy oak door of the Gilded Spoon. Pushing it open was an act of defiance, the bell above the entrance chiming a clear, challenging note that sliced through the restaurant's feigned composure. The low murmur of conversation instantly ceased, every eye suddenly capable of seeing fixed upon her, a figure of grime and poverty juxtaposed against white linen and crystal. Shock, disgust, and confusion rippled across the faces of the patrons. She was an intrusion, a stark, uncomfortable reminder of the world they worked so hard to ignore. A woman at a nearby table actually recoiled, subtly gathering her expensive handbag closer to her body. A maitre d', impeccably dressed and radiating barely concealed fury, rushed towards her, his voice a low, threatening hiss. "Ma'am, you cannot be here. You need to leave immediately, or I will call building security." Brenda, however, did not break her stride or meet his hostile gaze. Her eyes were locked solely on Robert, the retired firefighter whose scarred face was now clouded with a mixture of surprise and mounting mortification. She stopped directly beside his table, ignoring the frantic gesturing of his aide, Ronald Harris. Her hands, calloused and grimy from sleeping rough, trembled slightly, but her voice, when she finally spoke, was surprisingly steady, pitched just above a whisper. "Captain, I saw what happened. Can I help you with your meal? Robert stared at her, bewildered. His mind, usually sharp and decisive, struggled to process the contradiction before him. A homeless woman, smelling faintly of wood smoke and damp city air, was offering him, the man of wealth and privilege, the very help his own family and peers had conspicuously denied. His first, reflexive instinct was a surge of shame, an urge to reject the offer, to maintain the fragile illusion of self-sufficiency. But then he met her eyes. There was no pity there, no gawking curiosity, and certainly no mercenary calculation. He saw only a deep, quiet understanding, a painful recognition of what it meant to be utterly exposed and vulnerable. It was an honest gaze, the first he had received in months. The raw, desperate hunger in his own stomach, coupled with the crushing weight of public embarrassment, momentarily eclipsed his pride. He took another deep breath, the decision taking shape not in his brain, but in his gut. He swallowed hard. Yes, he managed to croak out, the word a ragged concession to necessity. Please, yes. The maître d' was apoplectic. Sir, I must insist, this is unacceptable. We cannot have... But Robert silenced him with a single, searing look, the authority of the former captain flashing briefly in his eyes. She stays, she is my guest. The declaration was absolute, leaving no room for argument. Brenda sat down on the empty chair opposite Robert, settling in with a natural ease that seemed to momentarily hypnotize the onlookers. She took a clean fork from the table setting, her movements slow and meticulous. Gently, she cut a small piece of the salmon, and without a word guided the fork to Robert's mouth. The silence that followed was absolute, thicker than the expensive drapery hanging on the walls. It was a tableau of profound irony, the city's discarded tending to its wounded hero, while the supposed elite watched in stunned, judgmental silence. The atmosphere was charged with whispers and the subtle, clicking sound of a phone camera as someone tried to sneak a picture of the sensational scene. But Brenda, focused entirely on the small human task at hand, simply continued to feed him, her concentration a shield against the world's scrutiny. When the plate was finally cleared, leaving only a few crumbs, a deep sense of calm settled over Robert. The embarrassment had receded, replaced by an unfamiliar warmth. He looked at Brenda, truly seeing her for the first time, the lines of fatigue around her eyes, the dignity in her posture despite the rags. "Thank you," he said, the gratitude heavy in his voice, the two simple words inadequate to express the relief she had brought him. He introduced himself. "I'm Robert." She smiled, a rare momentary softening of her weathered face. "Brenda." A comfortable silence ensued, broken only when Robert leaned forward, his voice dropping to a serious, contemplative tone. "Brenda, I know this is sudden, but you can't go back out there tonight. That was the first genuine kindness I've seen in months, and I want to repay it." He looked around the room, still filled with the lingering hostility of the patrons, then back at her. "I want you to come home with me, just for the night. You can have a proper bath, eat a full hot meal, and sleep in a warm bed. No strings attached. You leave tomorrow morning, no questions asked." Brenda blinked, momentarily stunned. A mansion in Oakwood Hills was a world away from the damp cardboard she currently called a mattress. She searched his face, expecting to find mockery or pity, but found only sincerity and a raw earnestness. "Why, Robert?" she asked, her voice raspy from disuse. "Why risk the scandal? You don't know me." He met her gaze, the tremor in his hand less pronounced now that he wasn't holding a fork. "I know enough," he replied, a new light flickering in his eyes. "You saw me when no one else would. You gave me back a piece of my dignity, and right now that is worth more than everything I own. If this exploration of humanity, vulnerability and redemption is resonating with you, and you appreciate the power of stories that find light in the darkness, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your subscription is the fuel that allows us to keep crafting these deep, meaningful narratives and share them with the world. Also, tell us, if you had been a patron in the Gilded Spoon that day, what is one simple, non-monetary gesture you would have offered Robert to help him in his moment of distress? Share your creative idea in the comments below. The days following Brenda's single night of rest at the Jensen estate became a turning point neither of them could have predicted. The single night extended into a week and then a month, without a formal agreement or forced obligation. Brenda simply stayed, drawn by the quiet, desperate need she perceived beneath Robert's polished exterior, and Robert, in turn, found himself craving her steady, unassuming presence. His vast mansion, once a museum of his former glory, began to shed its chilling sterility. Brenda introduced a simple yet profound element of life. She didn't clean with the clinical detachment of the hired staff. She moved objects, reorganized the shelves, and tended to the struggling indoor plants with a loving care that seemed to breathe life back into the air itself. She was a silent, nurturing force, slowly chipping away at the emotional fortress Robert had constructed around himself. Their relationship evolved from one of obligation to one of true companionship. Every morning Brenda would bring him his coffee, waiting patiently as he struggled to grasp the mug, sometimes steadying the cup with her own hand without being asked. She would talk about the simple pleasures of the day, the way the sun hit the western wall, the intricate patterns of condensation on the windows, the distant sound of the neighborhood children laughing. Robert, who had spent months listening only to the internal monologue of his pain, began to listen to the world again through her eyes. More importantly, Brenda challenged him. When his physical therapist, a young woman named Laura Perez, came by, Robert would often sink into self-pity, refusing to attempt the painful hand exercises. It was Brenda who stepped in, her tone gentle yet utterly firm. "Captain," she would say, using his old title deliberately, "you didn't let the fire beat you, so don't let this tiny tremor define you. You taught people to fight. Now fight for yourself." She would sit beside him, holding his wrist to give him just enough stability to manage the smallest movements, her presence a silent promise of support. When he managed to hold a pencil for a fleeting 45 seconds, she didn't offer effusive praise, but a simple, heartfelt, "That's good, Robert. That's real progress." Her belief in him was a tangible force, a subtle flame that rekindled his own lost determination. Laughter, small, genuine bursts of it, started to echo in the halls, often when Brenda would jokingly compare his stubbornness to the feral alley cat she used to feed back on the streets. However, the bubble of their quiet sanctuary was bound to burst. One damp grey afternoon, Robert's former business partner, a man named Matthew Gonzalez, pulled his luxury sedan up to the entrance. Matthew was all sleek suits and calculated concern, a man who measured success in quarterly reports. He was there to discuss the divestment of some company assets, but his real agenda was to size up the damaged goods. Robert. Matthew treated Brenda with barely concealed condescension, his eyes raking over her still humble attire. He tried to ignore her presence during the conversation, but Brenda, sensing Robert's growing fatigue, interjected with a simple, common-sense observation about the market risks Matthew was glossing over. Matthew's face flushed with immediate rage. "Robert, with all due respect, who is this woman? She has no place commenting on our portfolio. You're letting some vagabond compromise your judgment and your reputation. You need to send her away before she tarnishes everything you built." The words, spoken with the venom of class prejudice, hung heavy in the air. Robert felt the familiar sting of his old pride, the urge to conform, to apologize for the embarrassment. But then he looked at Brenda, standing quietly, her head held high, refusing to be shamed. He looked at Matthew, his face a mask of avarice and judgment, and saw only the emptiness of the life he was desperately trying to escape. Robert pushed himself up slightly in his wheelchair, his voice slow but authoritative, the captain's voice returning for the first time in months. "Brenda has more human worth than every self-serving associate you've introduced me to in the last decade. She taught me how to live again. If you have a problem with her, you have a problem with me, and you can take your proposal and leave." Matthew, stunned by the ferocity and clarity of Robert's refusal, sputtered an excuse and retreated, the slamming of his car door sounding like a defeated cannon shot. A few weeks after the confrontation with Matthew, the true climax of Robert's personal journey unfolded. It was a rainy, blustery morning, the kind that amplified the sense of confinement. Robert, feeling frustrated by a particularly resistant tendon in his hand, decided he needed to prove his progress to himself. He heard Brenda in the kitchen, and propelled by a burst of raw, reckless determination, he decided to attempt to stand without her assistance. He gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, straining every muscle, his breath ragged. He managed to lift himself a fraction of an inch, a monumental effort, but the tremor, like a sudden shockwave, ripped through his exhausted body. He lost his grip, and with a sickening thud, he collapsed, hitting his head against the stone hearth. Brenda, hearing the crash, rushed in, her heart pounding against her ribs. She found Robert on the floor, dazed. soaked from the rain blowing in through the open door and struggling in a chaotic tangle of limbs and shame. His face was twisted in an expression of raw, furious despair. He pushed her away as she tried to help. "Leave me, Brenda. Just leave me here. I'm useless. I'm nothing but a wreck," he sobbed, the tears mingling with the dampness on his scarred cheek. He couldn't bear for her to see him so utterly defeated. Brenda didn't back away this time. Her own eyes were wet, but her determination was ironclad. She knelt beside him, embracing him fiercely despite his struggles. "You listen to me, Robert Williams," she said, her voice husky with emotion. "I have slept on concrete in blizzards. I have been starved and ignored and kicked, but I am not leaving you. I am here because you are worth fighting for. I'm here because you are the kindest, bravest soul I have ever met. I'm here because, Robert, I love you." The words, simple, genuine, and delivered amidst the sound of the rain and the debris of his collapse, stopped Robert cold. Love, an emotion he thought had died the moment he went through the glass floor of the burning warehouse. He looked at her, truly saw the sacrifice in her eyes, the vulnerability of her confession, and realized that she saw past the scars, past the wheelchair, past the millions, to the man beneath. The shame vanished, replaced by a profound, overwhelming sense of belonging. He finally yielded, resting his head against her shoulder as she helped him slowly, painfully, back into his chair. In that moment of complete surrender and acceptance, their bond was forged in unshakable truth. The final act of their story unfolded 3 months later, under a clear, bright winter sun. Robert had been tirelessly working on his recovery, fueled now not by pride, but by Brenda's belief and his rediscovered will to live fully. He was walking short distances now with a cane, his tremor lessened but still present, a constant reminder of his journey. He took Brenda back to the Gilded Spoon, not for lunch, but for a private early evening reception he had arranged. The restaurant was filled with his old associates, former colleagues from the fire department, and even his distant children, all curious about the transformation in the reclusive captain. Robert stood at the front of the room, leaning on his cane, the spotlight hitting his scars. He spoke not of business but of the fire, not the one that burned him, but the one that nearly extinguished his soul. "I stood in this very room a few months ago, defeated. I dropped my food and every single person here, people who owed me respect, looked away." He paused, letting the silence settle. And then Brenda walked in, a woman the world deemed worthless, disposable. She saw me, truly saw me, and gave me her hand. He then did what no one expected. He lowered his cane, took a single controlled step away from it, and with his still shaking right hand, he raised a water glass to his lips and took a sip. The small act was met with a spontaneous, immediate wave of applause and stunned whispers. He then turned to Brenda, who was radiant in a simple, elegant sapphire dress, a gift from Robert, though she still preferred the comfort of soft cotton. "Brenda gave me my life back," Robert continued, his voice ringing with conviction. "She taught me that courage isn't dodging flames. It's showing up when the world expects you to hide. It's accepting help. And it's seeing worth where others see only lack." He then dropped to one knee, a move that was challenging, painful, and profoundly deliberate. He opened a small velvet box containing a modest but beautifully cut antique sapphire ring that matched her dress. "Brenda, you are my home, my strength, and my reason. Will you be my wife?" Brenda's tears were instant, but her smile was the brightest thing in the room. "Yes, Robert. Always yes." Their wedding was a small, joyous affair that blended the elegance of Robert's world with the simple warmth of Brenda's rediscovered life. Robert, walking unassisted, met his bride at the altar. They bought a smaller house, a cozier, lived-in space that truly felt like a home. Robert didn't return to firefighting, but dedicated himself to a foundation that helped veterans and first responders struggling with internal and external scars, with Brenda at his side, running the charity's outreach programs. His life was simpler, richer, and filled with a profound gratitude that no amount of money could buy. The ultimate lesson was not about a millionaire helping a homeless woman, but about a hero realizing that true strength is found not in self-reliance, but in the vulnerable, authentic connection to another human heart.